The hammer fell from Elias Townsend's hand the moment Caroline Merritt said those 4 words. "I want you to stay." He stood there in the late afternoon sun of June 1882, his shirt soaked through with 2 weeks of honest labor, splinters buried deep in his palms, every muscle in his body carved down to something harder and leaner than when he'd arrived at her property. The fence was done. Every post driven into the red Oklahoma earth, every rail nailed flush and straight, the entire eastern boundary of her 37 acres enclosed in cedar wood that would outlast them both. He had built exactly what she asked for. He had done it right. He had done it without complaint, without expectation, without once letting himself believe that the way she looked at him across the supper table meant anything more than gratitude. And now she was standing at the gate he had hung just that morning, her dark auburn hair loose around her shoulders in a way she never allowed during working hours, her green eyes holding something so raw and frightened that he could barely look at it directly. "Caroline." His voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped clean of all pretense. "You know I can't stay. That wasn't the arrangement." "I know what the arrangement was." She didn't move from the gate. She was gripping the top rail of his fence, her knuckles white against the cedar. "I'm changing it." "You can't just change it." "Why not? It's my land. It's my fence. You built it for me." Her chin lifted in that way he had already cataloged and memorized against his better judgment, that particular angle of stubborn beauty that made every rational thought in his head dissolve into something useless and longing. "And now I am asking you to stay inside it." The words hung in the hot Oklahoma air between them like something sacred and terrifying. Elias stared at her. All the secrets he had been carrying for the past 2 weeks, all the dark past he had ridden in with and never disclosed, all the reasons a man like him had no business standing on the right side of a decent woman's gate, rose up in his chest like floodwater. "You don't know what you're asking," he said quietly. "Then tell me." She released the rail and took 1 step toward him. "Tell me why you keep leaving the table early. Tell me why you sleep with a rifle within arm's reach. Tell me what it is you're running from, Elias, because I have watched you every single day for 2 weeks, and whatever it is, whatever dark past you carried onto my land, I am not afraid of it." He picked the hammer up from the dirt. He didn't know why, he just needed something to hold. "You should be," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did the most extraordinary thing. She stepped back to the gate and swung it open from the inside, leaving it standing wide. "Come in," she said softly, "or go, but if you go, be honest with yourself about why." That was how it started. Or rather, that was the moment everything that had been building for 2 weeks finally broke the surface like a spring under drought pressure. To understand why those 4 words shattered him the way they did, you have to go back to the morning he first rode up to her property line, a stranger on a borrowed horse with a carpet bag full of tools and a letter of introduction he had written himself. It was the 14th of May, 1882, and the Indian Territory dust was in his teeth before he even reached the Merritt homestead. Elias Townsend was 29 years old and had not spent more than 3 consecutive months in any single place since he was 19. He was not a drifter by temperament. He was a drifter by necessity, and there was a difference he spent considerable private energy maintaining in his own mind. A drifter by temperament was a man who couldn't settle because he didn't want to. A drifter by necessity was a man who couldn't settle because settling would get someone killed. The someone in his case was him. He had been a deputy marshal out of Fort Smith, Arkansas, for 2 years beginning in 1878. He had been good at it. He had been, according to Judge Isaac Parker, one of the best young deputies he'd seen come through his court, with a natural instinct for tracking and a gift for talking men down before guns had to come out. That gift had earned him enemies of a particular and persistent variety. A man named Doyle Cutter, who ran a horse theft operation across the territory border, and whom Elias had testified against in the fall of 1879, had made it a secondary occupation to ensure that Elias Townsend never felt safe enough to plant roots. Cutter had served 18 months and come out angrier and more focused. He had resources. He had men. He had the particular patience of someone who had turned a grudge into a religion. Elias had resigned the marshals in early 1881, not because he was afraid of Cutter personally, but because two of the men he'd worked alongside had been hurt on his account, and he refused to let anyone else pay the cost of his history. He had gone quiet since then, moving between ranch work and carpentry, and whatever honest labor would take him from one county to the next, without establishing enough of a presence to be found easily. He had arrived in the Cherokee Strip region of the territory because he had heard through a passing freighter that a widow woman named Merritt was paying fair wages for a man who could build fence and handle himself without causing trouble. The freighter, a weathered man named Amos Garrett who drove the supply route from Caldwell into the territory, had described the situation plainly. Woman inherited 40 acres from her late husband. Good soil, decent water, but no barriers. Cattle from the neighboring Lachlan spread keep crossing her land and tearing up her kitchen garden. She's been asking Lachlan to respect the boundary for 6 months, and he's been ignoring her because she's a woman alone and he figures she'll give up and sell. Elias had needed work. He had needed somewhere quiet to disappear into for a few weeks while he figured out his next move. A fencing job on a remote homestead sounded exactly right. He had not accounted for Caroline Merritt. She was standing in her doorway when he rode up, and she was not what he expected. He had formed a mental image of a widow on hard times, older, careworn, the edges of her worn down to something fragile. The woman in the doorway was 26 years old, composed as stone, with green eyes that assessed him from horseback to heel in approximately 4 seconds and then delivered their verdict without a word. She wore a plain blue work dress and her hair was pinned up with practical efficiency, and there was nothing soft about the way she held herself. She was not fragile, she was concentrated. "Mr. Townsend," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Amos said you were handy." She stepped off the porch and walked directly to him, which he noticed because most women would have stayed on the steps. She looked at his hands. He was right about that, at least. "I build good fence," he said. "And I don't cause trouble. Those are the 2 things I need most." She turned and walked back toward the house. "Come in and I'll explain the property lines." That first evening, she had shown him the land survey map spread across her kitchen table, a proper surveyor's plat she'd had done the previous autumn when she decided that the legal boundary of her property needed to be established formally rather than just existing as an understanding between neighbors. The plat showed 37 acres, not 40 as Garrett had said, bounded on the east by a creek that had been running dry since the previous summer, on the north by a ridge of limestone outcroppings, on the west by the road that ran south toward the nearest town of Beecher's Crossing, and on the south by the invisible line that separated her land from the spread belonging to Warren Lachlan. Lachlan was the real problem. She explained it without drama, which he appreciated. Her late husband, Thomas Merritt, had died of a fever in the autumn of 1880 after only 2 years on the property. He had been a good man, she said it plainly without embellishment, and she had loved him in the quiet and steady way of 2 sensible people who had built a life together by agreement and mutual respect. She had not fallen to pieces when he died. She had been grieved and she was done grieving, and now she was managing what he had left her. What he had left her was good land with a bad neighbor. Warren Lachlan had been slowly expanding his cattle operation westward for 3 years, and he had made it clear in a dozen small ways that he considered the Merritt land an inconvenience standing between him and his ambitions. He had twice offered to buy it, and both times she had declined. After the second refusal, his cattle had begun appearing on her land with increasing regularity, churning up her vegetable garden and destroying the young orchard she had planted in the eastern quarter. "I'm not selling," she said, still looking at the map, "but I need a fence that makes that statement for me without requiring me to make it every morning." "That's what a good fence does," Elias said. She looked up at him. "You understand that Lachlan won't be pleased." I generally don't do my best work trying to please the wrong people." Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile exactly, but the cousin of one. "All right, Mr. Townsend. Let me show you where the posts need to go." He had moved his bedroll into the small outbuilding she had cleared for the purpose, a former chicken coop that had been cleaned out and fitted with a cot and a shelf. It was comfortable enough. He had stayed in far worse. The arrangement was $4 a week plus meals and the outbuilding accommodations, and Caroline Merritt cooked the best food he had eaten in at least 3 years without making a single production of it. He noticed this about her in the first 24 hours and spent the next week trying not to notice anything else. She was organized in a way that suggested a mind that found disorder physically distressing. Every tool had a hook or a shelf. The kitchen garden, despite Lachlan's cattle depredations, was planted in straight rows with each variety labeled on small wooden stakes in her handwriting. The ledger book on the kitchen shelf was up to date to the current week. She woke before sunrise and was asleep by 9 in the evening, and she did not waste words or time on anything she had already decided. She also read every night for 30 minutes before she put out the lamp, and she read serious books, not the dime novels that most people in the territory kept around. He knew this because he could see the light in her window from the door of his outbuilding, and on the second evening when she had come to bring him supper, she'd had a volume of Charles Darwin tucked under her arm that she'd set on the fence post while she handed him his plate. "You're a reader," he said, not meaning it to sound as surprised as it did. "I'm a thinker," she said. "Reading is how I do it efficiently." She picked up the book and walked back to the house without explaining further. He thought about that for a long time after she was gone. The fence work itself was hard and honest, and he was glad of it. He started at the southern boundary, where the problem with Lachlan was most acute, marking the line with stakes and string before beginning to dig post holes in the red clay soil. The Oklahoma summer was already asserting itself, and by mid-morning each day, he was working in heat that pressed down on the back of his neck like a flat hand. He drank water from the creek bucket she left on the property edge each morning without being asked, and he worked through until the light failed. On the third day, Lachlan came. Elias heard the horses first. He straightened from the post hole he was digging and turned to see 2 riders coming from the south, the larger one on a gray horse that Elias recognized immediately as a man accustomed to making entrances. Warren Lachlan was perhaps 50, broad through the chest with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had curdled into authority. He wore a good hat and a poor expression. The man behind him was younger, lean and watchful, the kind of hired rider who was paid to be present at conversations without participating in them. Lachlan pulled up his horse just short of the first stakes Elias had driven and looked down at him with the particular condescension of a man who had confused land ownership with human superiority. "What are you doing on this property?" Lachlan said. "Building a fence for Mrs. Merritt." Elias kept his voice level. He had learned years ago as a deputy that the first 10 seconds of any confrontation set the temperature for everything that followed. "There's no fence needed here." "The boundary is well understood." "The boundary is well understood by Mrs. Merritt," Elias said. "She'd like it to be understood by your cattle as well." A muscle worked in Lachlan's jaw. "This is excessive." "I have an arrangement with—" "You had an arrangement with Thomas Merritt," Elias said. "Mr. Merritt passed. You'll need a new arrangement with his widow, and as far as I can tell, her arrangement is a fence." He picked up his post-hole digger and went back to work with the deliberate calm of someone who has decided the conversation is over. Lachlan sat on his horse for another 30 seconds. Then he turned and rode back south without another word. The lean rider watched Elias for a moment longer before following. That evening, Caroline had come out to look at the day's progress, and he had told her about Lachlan's visit. She had stood looking at the 3 posts he'd gotten in the ground and was quiet for a moment. "Did he threaten you directly?" she asked. "No, he's too careful for that. He's too careful because he knows I have a copy of the property survey filed with the county clerk in Caldwell." She looked at the posts with something satisfied in her expression. He didn't expect me to do that. He thought I was someone who could be waited out. He was wrong about that, Elias said. She looked at him sideways. Yes. He was, she paused. Thank you for not backing down. That's what you're paying me for. No, she said quietly. I'm paying you to build a fence. Not backing down is something else. She walked back to the house. He watched her go and told himself firmly to stop watching her go. The trouble with living close to a person you were trying not to notice was that you ended up noticing everything. He noticed that she hummed under her breath when she was working in the kitchen and stopped immediately if she thought someone could hear. He noticed that she kept a small photograph on the mantel, her late husband and herself, and she dusted it every morning with the same care she applied to everything else, no more and no less, which told him her grief had settled into something healthy and finished rather than an open wound. He noticed that she was braver than she let on, that every morning when she went out to tend her garden in the corner closest to Lachlan's property line, she took her late husband's old shotgun and leaned it against the fence post nearest her, not because she expected to need it, but because she refused to be caught needing it and unprepared. He noticed that she watched him working from the kitchen window sometimes, and that she looked away the instant he turned around, and that she never acknowledged doing it. He noticed all of this and kept it carefully arranged in a part of himself that he had no intention of acting on, because whatever he felt building in that direction was not something a man with his situation could afford to encourage. The fifth evening, she brought his supper to the outbuilding instead of leaving it on the porch as usual, and he saw by her expression that something had happened. Lachlan sent one of his men today, she said. While you were working on the north end, he came to the house. Elias set down his tin cup. What did he say? He said, Mr. Lachlan had a final offer for the property and that I should give it serious consideration before. She paused, and the pause carried weight before the situation became complicated. He said complicated. He used that exact word. She looked at him steadily. I told him to take the offer and leave it at the county clerk's office in writing if Mr. Lachlan wanted to pursue it through proper channels. He left without another word. You did that right, Elias said. I know I did. She sat down on the wooden crate he'd been using as a stool and folded her hands in her lap. She looked tired in a way she hadn't looked before, and he understood it wasn't physical tiredness. It was the particular exhaustion of having to be strong in the face of something that required strength you hadn't budgeted for. I just want the fence finished. 8 more days, he said. Maybe 9 if we get rain. She looked up at him. They were sitting close in the small space, closer than they usually managed, and he could see in the lamplight that her composure was costing her something tonight. Elias, she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name. Do you ever get tired of moving? The question landed somewhere soft and unguarded. He looked at her for a moment. Every day, he said honestly. She nodded as if this confirmed something she had been working out. She stood up and smoothed her dress. Good night, she said, and she walked back across the yard to the house, and he sat in the dark of the outbuilding with his hands wrapped around a cooling tin cup and the particular sensation of a man watching a door he'd told himself he couldn't open rattle on its hinges. The next morning brought rain. Not the brief prairie shower that passed in 20 minutes, but a steady rolling Oklahoma rain that came in off the flat country to the north and settled in for the day, turning the red soil to rust-colored mud and making fence work impossible. Elias mended his tools and resharpened his post-hole digger and rewrapped the handles on 2 hammers and organized his remaining hardware with the focused attention of a man who was using work to wall off thinking. By mid-morning, Caroline appeared in the doorway of the outbuilding with 2 cups of coffee, which was so far outside their established routine that he looked up in surprise. You'll go mad in here with nothing to do, she said. She handed him a cup and sat on the crate he'd been using and showed every sign of planning to stay. I'm comfortable enough, he said. You've reorganized those nails 4 times since breakfast. She looked at the rows of sorted hardware with calm amusement. I was watching from the kitchen. He felt a complicated warmth at that admission. She had acknowledged watching him this time. Something had shifted overnight. They talked for 2 hours. He could not have told you afterward exactly how it happened, the way a river can't account for the channel it cuts. It began with the rain and became the territory, and then it became larger things, the particular isolation of the homesteader's life. The way the sky out here made you feel simultaneously large and small. What had brought them both to this specific piece of red Oklahoma ground? She told him about growing up in Illinois, the second daughter of a schoolteacher father who had believed absolutely in educating his daughters as well as any son, and how she had come west at 23 with Thomas Merritt because Thomas had wanted land of his own and she had wanted to see what was at the edge of the map. "Did you find it?" Elias asked. "I found good soil and bad neighbors and 2 years of a good marriage and then a grave on the ridge," she said without self-pity. "It wasn't what I came looking for, but it's mine. That's more than a lot of people have." She looked at him. "What did you come west looking for?" He was quiet for a moment. "I came west to be a lawman," he said. "I thought the law out here needed people who believed in it. And it does, but believing in it costs more than I budgeted." He did not say anything more about that, and she didn't push. She had the rare quality of knowing when a silence was not emptiness but content, and she sat in it with him for a minute before the conversation moved somewhere lighter. He learned that she was trying to get a small apple orchard established in the eastern quarter, and had already lost a dozen saplings to frost and drought and Lachlan's cattle. He told her about the best soil conditioning he knew for apple trees, something an old German orchardist in Missouri had taught him during a winter he'd spent on a farm outside St. Louis. She listened with the focused attention. She gave everything and asked specific questions that showed she had been thinking seriously about it. And by the time the rain began to slow, he had agreed to look at the surviving trees that afternoon and give her his assessment. Walking through the orchard with her in the wet aftermath of the rain, the air scrubbed clean and smelling of mud and green things, he felt something dangerous and wonderful happening in the region of his chest. She walked just ahead of him, crouching to examine the base of each young tree with her hands, turning back now and then to say something about what she was seeing, her hair beginning to escape its pins in the humidity. She was entirely absorbed in the trees and entirely beautiful, and he kept his hands at his sides and his expression neutral, and thought very hard about all the reasons this was not a path he could walk. He thought about Doyle Cutter. He thought about the 2 deputies who had been hurt. He thought about what it meant to let someone get close when you were a man with enemies who had no scruple about reaching someone through the people nearest him. He thought about the fact that in 8 or 9 more days the fence would be finished, and he would ride away from this property and these apple trees, and this woman with her composure and her Darwin and her habit of not looking away from difficult things, and that would be exactly right because that was the arrangement. He thought all of this, and none of it helped very much. On the 8th day, Lachlan escalated. It happened early morning, before Elias had gotten his tools to the south end where he was finishing the gate installation. He heard the sound of cattle and came around the eastern corner of the property to find 6 head of Lachlan's longhorn standing in Caroline's kitchen garden, having broken through the temporary wire barrier she'd strung along the garden's south edge the previous autumn. 2 of the cattle were in the young orchard. He moved the cattle out with focused efficiency, and then he found the wire barrier and saw immediately that it had not simply broken. It had been cut. Clean cuts in 3 places, recently made, still shiny at the wire ends. He went and found Caroline and showed her. She looked at the cut wire for a long moment. "That's a different thing than a fence not holding," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." Her jaw was set and her green eyes were very still. "How much damage?" 3 rows of vegetable starts were destroyed, and 2 of the young apple trees had been badly worked over by the cattle. One of the trees was almost certainly gone. She walked through the damage with him, and she did not cry or fall apart or do anything that would have felt justified and understandable. She assessed it. She cataloged it. She walked back to the house and came back out with her husband's old shotgun and a notepad, on which she began writing down everything she had seen in careful detail with dates and descriptions. "Are you going to Beecher's Crossing?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning. I'm going to see Sheriff Hawthorne and show him this record." She finished writing and looked up. "Will you come with me?" "Of course," he said. They went to Beecher's Crossing the next morning in her wagon, a 6-mile drive south along the road in the early cool of the day, with the grassland rolling out on both sides under a sky so blue it was almost violent. Caroline sat on the wagon seat with her notepad on her knee and her back straight, and did not talk much during the drive, which he understood. She was composing herself for what she needed to do. Beecher's Crossing was not a large town. It had the essential architecture of its function: a general store, a livery, a blacksmith, 2 saloons, a bank that looked slightly more prosperous than everything around it, a church that held services twice a month when the circuit preacher came through, and a sheriff's office that doubled as a jail. It also had a post office inside the general store, and Elias felt something go tight in his gut when they drove past it, as he always did in every town with a post office, because post offices were places where wanted notices ended up, and he was not wanted in any official capacity, but he knew that Cutter had men who watched for his name and his face. Sheriff Hawthorne was a small, careful man of about 50 who listened to Caroline's account with his hands folded on his desk and his face giving very little away. He looked at her documentation. He looked at Elias once in a considering way that had nothing threatening in it, just the assessment of a man trying to understand the full picture. "I can speak to Lachlan," the sheriff said, "but I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Merritt. Proving those wires were cut deliberately, rather than broken by the cattle themselves, is going to require more than the observation that the cuts look clean." "I understand the evidentiary problem," Caroline said. "I'm not asking you to arrest anyone. I'm asking you to create an official record that I have come to you with this complaint, and that the damage to my property has been documented, so that when it happens again, there is a pattern established." Hawthorne looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You've thought about this carefully." "I have had approximately 6 months to think about it," she said. They rode back in the afternoon, and somewhere on the stretch of road between town and her property, the quality of the silence between them changed. He was aware of her beside him on the wagon seat, the warmth of her arm occasionally touching his when the wagon lurched, the particular smell of her hair in the warm afternoon that he had been making himself not notice for 10 days. "You were good in there," he said. She turned to look at him. She had been thinking about something and he had interrupted it. "I was necessary," she said. "That's different from good." "Is it?" She considered this. "Good implies going beyond what's required. What I did in there was the minimum required to protect my rights. I shouldn't have to go beyond minimum to be taken seriously." He thought about that for a long time. About what it cost a woman alone in this territory to stand in a sheriff's office and make her case with documentation and precision, and the full knowledge that the man behind the desk might dismiss her regardless. "You're right," he said. "It shouldn't require anything more than that." She looked at him with something new in her eyes. Not warmth exactly, something more serious than warmth. Recognition, perhaps. The look of someone encountering a perspective they hadn't expected. They did not talk again until they reached her property, but it was a different kind of silence now. The kind that has content in it. The kind between people who have understood something about each other. The fence was finished on the 14th day. He had worked himself hard those last 3 days to complete it. Conscious on some level he refused to examine that finishing it meant leaving, and that some part of him was putting off leaving even as another part was insisting it was necessary and right. The gate on the south side was the last piece. A proper swinging gate with iron hinges he'd paid for out of his own wages in Beecher's Crossing, because the ones she had bought were not heavy enough for the purpose. He hung the gate on a Tuesday morning in late June with the sun already laying full and hot across the land, and he stood back and looked at the whole eastern and southern boundary, and felt the quiet satisfaction of good work completed. The fence was not ostentatious. It was not the kind of fence built to impress. It was the kind of fence built to last, to serve its purpose, to stand between what was hers and what was not with a plain and settled authority. He heard her footsteps behind him and turned. She was standing at the gate he'd just hung, looking at the whole run of fence with an expression he had never seen on her before. It was not the composed assessment she usually wore. It was something opened up and young and unguarded, and he realized with a sharp and sudden clarity that this fence meant something to her beyond the practical. It meant that she was going to be all right, that she was not going to lose this, that the 2 years she had spent here, the good marriage and the grave on the ridge and the mornings alone and the fight with Lachlan, all of it was going to hold. The fence was the physical proof that she was still standing. He did not say any of this. He just watched her look at it, then she looked at him and she said it, "I want you to stay," and the hammer fell from his hand. Now standing in the late afternoon with the gate open between them and her green eyes holding something that was either the most honest thing he had ever been offered or the most dangerous, he made himself say what needed to be said. "Caroline," he walked toward her. He stopped close enough that they were almost within arm's reach and she had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. "I have to tell you something, before anything else, before you ask me again." She waited. She was very still. "I told you I used to be a lawman." He held her gaze. "What I didn't tell you is that I have an enemy, a specific man. His name is Doyle Cutter, and he has resources and patience and a long memory, and he has made it his occupation to ensure I don't settle anywhere for too long. Not because of any legal business, because of a personal grudge. I testified against him. He served time, and he has never forgiven it." She was listening. She did not flinch. "I have been moving for over a year," he said. "Not because I'm a coward. Because the last time I let someone get close to me, 2 men who were my colleagues got hurt, badly, because Cutter reached me through them." He paused. "The next part was the hardest part. If I stay here, Caroline, you become a way to reach me. I do not want to be that for you. I do not want to be the thing that brings danger to your land." She was quiet for so long that he thought she was going to close the gate. Instead, she said very calmly, "How long ago did Cutter get out of prison?" 18 months ago. "And in 18 months has he found you?" "No, but how does he find you when he does find you? How does he know where to look?" He frowned. "Through my name, through records, through people who recognize me from the territory." "Then you stop using your full name," she said. "Elias is a common enough given name. And you are here on a property that is not registered to you, in a region Cutter has no known business in." She tilted her head. "I'm not dismissing the danger. I'm suggesting it's manageable with intelligence rather than perpetual flight." He stared at her. "You're reasoning about this." "I reason about everything." There was something warm breaking through her composure now, carefully and under control, but breaking through. "It's a protective habit." "Caroline, do you want to stay?" she asked directly. No architecture of argument around it, just the question clean and standing. He looked at her in the golden late afternoon light, at the fence he had built with his hands, at the land behind her that she had fought for and refused to surrender, at the gate she was holding open with her knuckles white against the rail. "Yes," he said. It came out quieter than anything else he'd said in years, like something he had been holding in a closed fist for a very long time. "Yes, I want to stay," she exhaled. It was small and controlled, but it held an enormous amount of relief. She stepped back and he walked through the gate. They did not embrace. They were not the kind of people who moved quickly toward things like that. But he walked through the gate she'd built into his fence, and they stood together inside the boundary of the land she had refused to give up, and the significance of it sat between them like a vow neither of them had spoken aloud yet. What followed was a week of adjustment. He moved his tools properly into the barn she offered, not as a guest, but as someone with a stake in the place. He fixed the garden rows the cattle had destroyed, turning fresh compost into the soil from the pile she maintained behind the house. He treated the damaged apple tree with the technique the old orchardist had shown him, trimming the damaged branches cleanly and wrapping the wounds to prevent further damage and rot, and he was cautiously hopeful it would survive. She treated the shift in arrangement with the same organized directness she applied to everything. She did not become suddenly soft or demonstrative. She simply included him. The supper table was set for two as a matter of course rather than as a special gesture. When she made her weekly inventory of the root cellar, she told him what she found, and they discussed what supplies needed restocking from Beecher's Crossing together. When she wrote in her ledger, she left the book open rather than closing it when he came near. He noticed these small openings and honored them without pushing further. He had enough experience of damage to know that the important things needed to be approached slowly. The first real moment came on a Thursday evening, 9 days after he had walked through the gate. They had eaten supper, and she had cleared the table, and he had been sitting with a cup of coffee, reading the old copy of a Kansas newspaper she had brought back from Beecher's Crossing. The lamp threw warm light across the kitchen. Outside, the last of the evening birds were going quiet. She sat down across from him with her Darwin and began reading and the ordinariness of it. Two people in a lamplit kitchen in the complete comfort of shared silence hit him somewhere under his ribs with a force he hadn't anticipated. He looked up from the newspaper. She was reading with her chin propped on one hand, her expression that of someone encountering an idea that was giving her something to push against, her lips slightly parted. She was wearing a different dress than her work dress, slightly softer in color, and her hair was half down from its daytime pins, and she was entirely absorbed in her book and entirely unaware of how she looked in the lamp light. And it was that last quality, the absolute lack of self-consciousness, that undid him. "Caroline," he said. She looked up, found his expression, her own stilled. "I need to say this before I lose the will for it," he said. "I don't have anything to offer you, that's certain. I've got a man somewhere in the territory who would like to cause me harm. I've got a past in law enforcement that's both an asset and a liability. I've got the contents of a carpetbag and a set of carpenter's tools, and whatever's in my character that you've been able to observe for 3 weeks. He paused. "But I've been sitting here for the past 10 minutes trying to imagine getting on a horse and riding away from this, and I can't do it. Not because I have nowhere to go, but because—" he stopped. "Try it again. Because this is the first place in 3 years that has felt like a place I was supposed to be." She had put down her book. She was looking at him with those green eyes that held everything very steadily. "I'm not asking for certainty," she said quietly. "I buried certainty on the ridge 2 years ago. I'm asking for honesty." She paused. "And you've just given me that." He reached across the table and he put his hand over hers. It was the first time he had touched her in any deliberate way, and the simplicity of it, the completeness, he felt that in every part of himself. She turned her hand over under his and held it. She didn't look away. "I'm not a woman who is afraid of difficult things," she said. "I know," he said. "And I am not asking you to be a man who pretends your past doesn't exist," she said. "I am asking you to be a man who faces it with me beside you instead of alone." He held her hand in the lamplight, and outside the night settled over the Oklahoma territory, and the fence he had built stood in the dark around the land she had refused to surrender. "I can do that," he said. They were not swept up in sudden passionate declarations. They were two careful, intelligent people who had each been shaped by loss and difficulty. And what grew between them over the following weeks had the quality of something true rather than something hasty. He began accompanying her to Beecher's Crossing on her weekly supply trips, not because she needed protection, but because they both liked the drive and the conversation. He met the people in town who mattered. Amos Garrett, the freighter, who greeted Elias with unsubtle satisfaction at having placed him well. Mrs. Alvarez, who ran the general store with her husband, and who gave Caroline a look of warm approval the first time she saw them walk in together. The Reverend Pierce, who came through once a month, and whom Caroline liked for his practical sermons and his willingness to talk about science without getting defensive. He also met Sheriff Hawthorne alone one afternoon while Caroline was visiting Mrs. Alvarez, and told the sheriff enough of the truth about his history to ensure that if anything came up regarding his name or his past, Hawthorne would hear it from him first rather than second-hand. Hawthorne listened the way he had listened to Caroline, with careful attention and minimal expression. When Elias finished, the sheriff said, "You were a deputy under Parker. 2 years, 1878 and 79. I know Parker's court by reputation. You're not the kind of man Parker hired unless you were solid." Hawthorne looked at him steadily. "I'll keep what you've told me close. If this cutter makes any movement in my territory, you'll hear about it before he finds you. I appreciate that." "Don't appreciate it too loudly," Hawthorne said dryly. "I've got an election next year." Lachlan, for his part, went quiet after the fence went up. Elias suspected this was partly the fence itself, partly the visit to Hawthorne, and partly the calculation of a man who was genuinely cautious about legal consequences, even if his hired men were less so. The cattle stayed on his side of the fence. No further wires were cut. Caroline recorded this absence of incident in her ledger with the same care she had applied to the incidents themselves, building a record of the dispute's resolution alongside the dispute's escalation. 3 months after Elias had walked through the gate, on a Saturday in late September with the first cool edge in the air and the grassland turning gold, he asked Caroline Merritt to marry him. He did it in the orchard. The damaged apple tree had survived. It was still young and thin-limbed, but it had put on new growth since he'd treated it, and was holding its shape with a kind of determined willingness that he thought he recognized. She was tying a loose support stake and she looked up when he stopped beside her. He had thought carefully about how to say it. He had the rings that had been his mother's in his vest pocket, a plain gold band and a smaller one with a chip of garnet, and he had been carrying them for 3 years because they were the only thing he had held onto during the years of moving. He had thought about speeches. He had discarded them. He was not a man who spoke in speeches, and she would not want a speech. "I want to ask you something," he said. She straightened and looked at him with full attention. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because I need the land or the house or any arrangement of convenience, because you are the best person I have ever met and being your husband would make me better than I am on my own." He paused. "And because I love you, Caroline, I have loved you since the rain." She was very still. "Since the rain," she said. "The day it rained and we talked in the outbuilding for 2 hours. He met her eyes. That was when I knew I was in trouble." Something broke loose in her expression. It was not her composure coming apart, but her composure coming down, set aside deliberately and consciously, revealing the warmth underneath that had been carefully managed for months. "I love you too," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very certain, the way her voice was when she had thought something through completely and arrived at a conclusion she was fully committed to. "I have loved you since you told Lachlan's man that you didn't do your best work trying to please the wrong people." She paused. "I thought, there is a man who knows his own worth." He reached into his vest pocket and brought out the rings. He held them out in his open palm, the plain gold band and the garnet band, and let her look at them. "These were my mother's," he said. "I've had them with me for 3 years. I think I was waiting to know who they were for." She picked up the garnet ring and held it between her fingers for a moment, turning it in the autumn light. Then she held out her left hand. He put the ring on her finger. It fit. He had not expected it to fit, but it did, which felt like the kind of thing that meant something. She looked at her hand for a moment, and then she looked at him, and then she stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he held her in the orchard with the autumn air around them and the fence he had built visible in every direction from where they stood, enclosing them both. He kissed her for the first time. She kissed him back with the same focused certainty she applied to everything she had decided was right. They were married 4 weeks later by Reverend Pierce, on the first Saturday of October, in the front yard of the homestead she had refused to give up. Caroline wore the good dress she had owned since Illinois and put a single dried flower from her garden in her hair. Elias wore his best shirt, which he had pressed the night before with a genuine flat iron Caroline had heated on the stove. The witnesses were Amos Garrett, who came out from Caldwell for the occasion and brought a bottle of good whiskey as a gift, and Miriam Alvarez from the general store, who brought preserved apricots and cried happy tears through the whole ceremony. Sheriff Hawthorne came. He shook Elias' hand and told Caroline she had good taste in carpenters, which made her laugh. Reverend Pierce performed the ceremony with the direct pragmatism of a man who conducted more marriages on the frontier than anywhere else in his ministry, and had developed an appreciation for brevity paired with sincerity. He said the words that mattered and they repeated the words that mattered back, and when he said they were married, Elias Townsend and Caroline Merritt Townsend stood in the October sunshine in front of their fence with their hands clasped, and looked at each other with the quiet and serious happiness of two people who had arrived somewhere they had not expected to find, but recognized immediately as home. The evening after the small celebration, after Amos and the Alvarezes had gone, and the Reverend had ridden on toward his next stop, they sat on the porch together in the cooling October dark with cups of tea, her head on his shoulder, the land stretching out quiet in all directions. "I should tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "I was going to sell," she said. "Before you came, I had not decided yet, but I was close to it. Lachlan wore me down more than I showed. After the second time his cattle got into the orchard, I sat in this house for 2 days trying to work out if I was being stubborn in a pointless direction." He looked down at the top of her head. "What made you decide not to?" "The orchard," she said. "I went out to look at the damaged trees and I thought, Thomas and I planted these together. We argued about the spacing. I wanted more room between them and he wanted to be optimistic about the ultimate size of the spread. We compromised." She paused. "And I thought if I sell, I am letting the argument be the last thing between us and the trees, and I didn't want that. I wanted the trees to grow. I wanted to see who was right about the spacing." He put his arm around her. She settled into it naturally. "Who was right?" he said. "I was," she said simply, but I would never have told him so in a way that felt unkind about it. He pressed his lips to her temple, soft and warm. She was quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "About Cutter? Not for myself," he said honestly, "not as much as I was. Because of Hawthorne. Because of you," he said. "Because you reason about fear instead of running from it. It makes me braver." She lifted her head and looked at him. In the darkness her eyes were very bright. "That is the most romantic thing you have said to me," she said. "I'm improving," he said. She laughed. It was the full laugh, not the controlled small smile she used as currency in interactions with the outside world, but the real one, warm and unguarded, and it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. The winter of 1882 into 1883 settled over the territory with a seriousness that tested everything. The cold came early and hard, the kind of deep freeze that cracked the frozen creek bed and killed 3 of Lachlan's cattle where they stood in his unprotected pasture. Elias spent the coldest weeks reinforcing the outbuildings against the wind, wrapping the vulnerable apple saplings in sacking to protect them from frost, and splitting enough firewood to fill the woodshed completely twice over. Caroline cooked through the winter with the focused domesticity of someone who had prepared carefully, and was executing a plan, filling jars and crocks with the preserved stores she had laid in through the autumn, adjusting recipes for what they had on hand with the calm ingenuity of someone who found problem-solving satisfying rather than stressful. The house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and good food, and the particular quietness of a dwelling where 2 people are at peace with each other. They talked through the long winter evenings with the expansiveness that cold and isolation produce in people who actually like each other. They talked about Illinois and about Fort Smith and about the law and about the land and about books and about what they believed about the world and God and the proper treatment of people who had less than you, and what they thought the territory would look like in another 20 years. He told her more about his deputy years, the things he had seen and done, and the lines he had held, and the lines he had watched other men cross. He told her about the Cutter case in full, not sparing the parts that reflected poorly on his own judgment. The moment he had trusted a man's word when he should have trusted evidence. The way pride had made him slow to ask for support when he needed it. She listened to all of it, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You've spent 3 years punishing yourself for doing your job well." He stared at her. "That's not. You testified against a guilty man. He went to prison. He came out angry. These are consequences of justice, not consequences of your error." She looked at him steadily. "What you're calling a mistake was a moment of human trust that someone exploited. The mistake was Cutter's. You've been carrying it as though it were yours." He was quiet for a long time. "You should have been a judge," he said finally. "I should have been a lawyer," she said without missing a beat. "Judges have to stay in one place." He laughed, and she looked pleased with herself in the particular way she looked pleased with herself when she had landed a point she had been setting up. In January, she told him she thought she might be with child. She said it in the morning over coffee, watching him steadily over the rim of her cup with that quality of attention that meant she was monitoring for a reaction she could not predict. The reaction she got was him setting down his cup and standing up from the table and crossing to her and pulling her to her feet and holding her for a long moment without saying anything, which apparently was the right response because when he pulled back she was smiling in a way that was not controlled at all. "Are you sure?" he said. "Not entirely," she said, "but fairly." She paused. "Are you all right?" "I'm better than all right," he said, his voice rough in a way that had nothing to do with distress. He stopped, tried to find the word for what was happening in his chest. "I'm very glad," he said, which did not capture it but was the truest thing he could say. By February she was certain. She was not ill with it as some women were, which she attributed to her general constitution, and refused to credit to luck in case luck proved unreliable. She continued her daily work with adjustments as they became necessary, practical and unsentimental about her changing body, in a way he found both admirable and quietly beautiful. He built a cradle in March. He made it from the best cedar he had remaining from the fence posts, sanding it smooth enough to run your palm across without catching, fitting the joints with the care he gave everything he built for her. He put it beside the bedroom wall, and she ran her hand across the side of it and then looked at him and said nothing, because what she felt was in her expression, and she knew he could read it. It was April when the word came about Cutter. Amos Garrett brought it on his supply run. He came to the door of the house looking for Elias with a specific quality of care in his face that served as its own warning, and Caroline, who was standing at the kitchen stove, turned and looked at Amos and then looked at Elias across the room, and her expression said, "Here it is." Elias stepped outside with Amos. "I heard it in Caldwell," Amos said. A man passing through the saloon there, one of the drifting types, was drinking heavy and talking about a fellow named Cutter who was looking for a man he had business with in the territory. He wasn't specific about a name, but he described you well enough. Amos looked at him with the directness of a man who believed in plain dealing. He knew about the Merritt land, Elias. He said the man he was looking for had settled with a widow woman on a homestead near Beecher's Crossing. Elias felt the cold certainty settle over him that he had known was coming and had hoped would wait a little longer. "How long ago?" he said. 3 days. I came as soon as the weather let me." "Thank you, Amos." He went back inside. Caroline was standing in the kitchen with her arms at her sides and her chin up and her green eyes completely steady. "I heard enough," she said. "I know." "Don't say you're leaving," she said quietly but with a firmness that stopped him mid-thought. "Caroline, don't." She crossed the room to him. She put her hands on his face, which she had never done before in quite that way, both palms against his jaw, and looked directly at him. "We face it together. That is what we agreed." "You're expecting a child," he said. "I'm not incapacitated," she said. "And I'm not going to let you walk out that door and disappear because a dangerous man is looking for you. That is not how we do things." Her eyes were very serious and very close. "You told me once that I make you braver. Now let me." He covered her hands with his. He held them there against his face for a moment. "All right," he said. "Together. They went to Sheriff Hawthorne that afternoon. The three of them sat in the sheriff's office, and Elias laid out what Amos had brought, and what he knew about Cutter's methods and likely resources. And Hawthorne listened with the focused attention of a man who had been a lawman in genuinely difficult places and knew how to plan rather than simply react. "I have federal contacts at Fort Smith still," Elias said, "from my time with the marshal's office. If Cutter has violated his parole terms, which the behavior Amos described would suggest, there may be active warrants I'm not aware of." "Write the letter," Hawthorne said. "I'll add my own endorsement and get it on the next stage to Caldwell, on to Fort Smith from there." To both of them. "In the meantime, I'd suggest you don't travel alone, either of you, and I'll put word out quietly to some people in Beecher's Crossing I trust to watch for unfamiliar faces with specific interest in your location." "We have the fence," Caroline said dryly. "At least anyone coming onto the property will have to come through a gate." Hawthorne looked at her. "You built fence." "He built it," she said with a small gesture toward Elias. "I asked for it. It amounts to the same thing." They wrote to Fort Smith that evening. Elias sat at the kitchen table with paper and ink and wrote carefully to the marshal's office, laying out the situation with the clarity and detail of someone trained to produce legal documentation. He named Cutter, cited dates and prior case references, and requested information on any outstanding warrants. He signed his full name, which was a calculated risk. He was done running. The response came in 3 weeks. A deputy marshal named Grierson wrote back to both Elias and Sheriff Hawthorne with the information that Doyle Cutter had in fact violated his parole terms the previous December by crossing state lines into the territory against the conditions of his release, and that an active federal warrant had been issued in February. The marshal's office had been attempting to locate him. They were glad to have a confirmed sighting area. 2 deputy marshals arrived in Beecher's Crossing in the 2nd week of May. They were young, both of them, hard-riding and efficient, and they conferred with Elias and Hawthorne with the collegial directness of the law enforcement community, which has a shorthand among those who have done the work. Within a week, through Hawthorne's network in the region and information Elias provided about Cutter's known associates, they located Cutter at a ranch north of Caldwell where he had been sheltering under an assumed name. The arrest was made without Elias being present. Hawthorne told him this deliberately, saying, "I know you'd go if you could, but your wife is 7 months along and there are 2 federal deputies to handle it. Let them earn their wages." Elias sat in the kitchen of his own house on the morning the arrest was made and held his wife's hand across the table. He did not know exactly when it happened until Hawthorne rode up to the gate 2 days later and said, through the gate, "It's done. Cutter's in federal custody, Fort Smith jurisdiction. He won't be seeing free air for a considerable time." Caroline looked at the sheriff for a moment, and then she turned to Elias. He felt the thing loosen in his chest that had been tight for 3 years. It was not dramatic. It did not feel like a sudden flood of relief. It felt like a muscle slowly releasing after a very long and sustained tension, the gradual and quiet return of something natural. "Thank you, James," Caroline said to the sheriff, with the warmth of someone who has been through something significant with a person and emerged on the other side of it holding them with new regard. Hawthorne tipped his hat. He looked at Elias. "You were right to settle," he said. "It's harder to find a man who's got a reason to stay in one place." Cutter's men were tripping over each other trying to track a moving target. They didn't know what to do with a man who had decided to stop moving. He rode back toward town. Elias stood at the gate of the fence he had built and looked at the land he was standing on and the woman standing beside him, her waist round with their coming child, her hair coming loose in the spring wind. "It's over," he said. "The threat is over," she said. She leaned against him. "The rest of it is just beginning." Their son was born on the 6th of June, 1883, at the homestead, with Miriam Alvarez serving as midwife and Elias pacing the length of the front porch in a state of focused anxiety that he found impossible to manage with his usual composure. When Miriam came out and told him it was a boy and that Caroline was well, He went inside immediately and sat beside the bed and looked at the two of them, his wife exhausted and composed and fiercely proud, and his son, red-faced and indignant and astonishingly small, wrapped in the quilt Caroline had made the previous winter. "He looks like he has opinions," Elias said. "He will," Caroline said with certainty. "What do you want to call him?" She had thought about this already. She usually had. "Thomas," she said, "for Thomas Merritt, and James for James Hawthorne, because there are people worth honoring." She paused. "Thomas James Townsend." He looked at her. "That's right," he said quietly. "That's exactly right." He put his hand on his son's head, that extraordinary smallness and warmth, and he felt something complete in a way that had no words for it, only the weight and warmth of this specific moment on this specific piece of land, inside this fence in the Oklahoma Territory in the summer of 1883. The apple trees bloomed that spring for the first time. The orchard she had planted with her first husband, and nearly lost to Lachlan's cattle and the hard winter, put out small white flowers in April, and Caroline walked through them in the early morning, and Elias watched her from the porch with their son in his arms, and the land spread out in every direction under the enormous sky, and the fence stood around them in the clean morning light, making its plain and settled statement. Lachlan sold his spread the following year and moved on to land in Texas. The new neighbor was a family named Crowther with 3 children and a cooperative attitude about boundaries, and Caroline welcomed them with preserved apricots and practical advice about the soil, and the boundary fence stood between the two properties as exactly what it had always been. Not a wall, but a definition. Life on the homestead found its rhythms. Elias worked the land with Caroline through the warm months, and took on occasional carpentry work for the people in Beecher's Crossing during the winters, building up a modest reputation for quality work that brought him steady enough employment to supplement the farm income. He kept in contact with Hawthorne and with the Fort Smith Marshal's office, not in any official capacity, but in the way of someone who believes in the law and knows its people, and is willing to be useful when asked. He was never a lawman again in any formal sense, but there were 2 occasions in the years that followed when his knowledge and his calm and his willingness to walk toward a difficult situation, rather than away from it, were valuable to people in the region who needed exactly that. Young Thomas Townsend grew with the relentless speed that children seem to reserve for their parents, going from red-faced indignation in a quilt to a walking and opinionated 2-year-old in what felt like an implausibly short time. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's deliberate way of approaching things he wasn't sure of, going still and watchful before he committed, which Caroline observed one afternoon and said, "He decides before he moves, just like you." "Is that a criticism?" Elias said. "It's an observation," she said, made with complete admiration. She paused. "On both counts." In the autumn of 1885, Caroline told Elias over supper that Thomas was going to have a sibling. She told him with the same composed directness she'd used the first time, watching him over the rim of her cup, and he looked at her with the same full and unguarded expression he'd had 2 years earlier, the expression he made no attempt to manage. "Good," he said. "That's all," she said with something light in her eyes. "It's the right word," he said. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. "Very good," he said. Their daughter was born in May of 1886, and Elias sat beside the bed and looked at her in the same state of wonder he had experienced with Thomas, the extraordinary smallness and completeness of a new person, the reality of her existing in the world as its own fact now and forever. She had his dark hair and Caroline's green eyes, and she seemed from the first hours of her life to be someone with very specific plans. "Eleanor," Caroline said, "for my mother." "Eleanor Townsend," he said, feeling how it sat. "Yes." He looked from his daughter to his wife, and then out the bedroom window at the land beyond the fence, the orchard in full spring flower, the kitchen garden beginning its seasonal resurrection, the post road visible in the distance with its occasional traffic of life moving through the territory. He thought about the morning he had ridden up to this property line as a stranger with a carpetbag and a need to disappear, and about the moment the hammer had fallen from his hand, and about everything that had grown up between those 2 points. He thought about the gate. He thought about walking through it. "What are you thinking?" Caroline asked. She was watching him with the attentiveness she had always applied to him from the beginning, that quality of seeing him fully and not looking away from what she found. "I'm thinking about the fence," he said. She smiled. It was the full, warm, real smile. "You always think about the fence." "You asked me to build it," he said. "I did. And then you asked me to stay inside it." He looked at her. "I want you to know that I understand what I was being asked. I want you to know that I have never once regretted saying yes." She looked at him for a long moment, their daughter between them, the land outside the window, the house around them that had become so fully theirs that the word home was not adequate. "Neither have I," she said. "Not for a single morning." He kissed her temple, soft and warm as always. She leaned into him. Outside, Thomas was somewhere in the yard making a sound that suggested he was conducting negotiations with the chickens. The apple orchard was in bloom. The fence stood in every direction, cedar posts in red Oklahoma earth, doing what a good fence does. Not a wall, a definition. "This is mine. This is ours. Come in through the gate or stay on your own side, but know the difference between the two." They knew the difference. They had known it since June of 1882, on a late afternoon when a hammer fell in the dirt, and a gate swung open, and 2 careful, serious people who had each been shaped by loss looked at each other and chose something harder and better than safety. They chose to stay. In the years that followed, the Townsend homestead became known in the Beecher's Crossing region as one of the most productive small farms in the Cherokee Strip. Not because of anything dramatic, but because of the consistent application of intelligence and effort, and the refusal to be worn down by difficulty. The orchard expanded to 22 trees by 1889, finally reaching the spacing that Caroline had argued for in the original planting, which she noted without smugness in her ledger. The kitchen garden was extended twice to accommodate the needs of a household that had grown. Thomas, at school age, attended the one-room school in Beecher's Crossing 3 days a week, and was instructed at home by his mother on the other days with the same educational rigor her own father had applied. A curriculum that included natural science, mathematics, history, and the kind of practical thinking that school often forgot to teach. He had his mother's capacity for reasoning and his father's stillness before a decision, and he was by age 8 already the most serious conversationalist in his class, which made him occasionally unpopular with his classmates and permanently at ease with adults. Eleanor, following in the wake of her brother's thoughtfulness, proved to be an entirely different creature, loud and delighted and physically fearless in a way that kept both parents attentive. She learned to ride before she was 5, which Elias taught her on a gentle mare he had acquired, and she approached the horse with the complete lack of caution that is either courage or ignorance in a child, and that becomes courage in an adult if it survives long enough to be tempered by experience. He taught them both to read land and weather and the behavior of animals. Caroline taught them both to write clearly and think precisely, and to value the opinion of someone who disagreed with you, because disagreement is often the fastest route to an idea you hadn't found yet. Between his knowing and her knowing, they gave their children an education that was better than anything officially available in the territory in that decade. Elias never stopped being grateful. He was careful about gratitude, never wearing it as sentimentality, but the private acknowledgement of it was a daily thing. Every morning when he walked out onto the porch and looked at the land and the fence and the orchard and heard the sounds of the household waking up, he registered it, the specific weight of it. The fact that he was here rather than somewhere else, that the path that had begun with a borrowed horse and a letter of self-introduction and a post-hole digger in red Oklahoma clay had led to this exact place. In the summer of 1890, exactly 8 years after he had first ridden up to the property line, they repainted the gate. It had weathered well, the cedar being naturally durable, but the latch hardware needed replacing, and the gate had developed a slight sag from years of use that he fixed by rehanging it on new hinges. Thomas, 9 years old and deeply interested in carpentry in the way of children who watch a skilled parent work, helped him with the rehanging, holding the gate level while his father drove the new hinge screws. "How come the fence is so important?" Thomas asked. He had the conversational habit, common to serious children, of asking the real question rather than leading up to it. Elias considered how to answer. He looked at the gate in his son's hands, the cedar worn smooth and dark with weather. "Your mother's neighbor wanted to take this land from her," he said. "Not by force, by wearing her down, by making it too hard to stay." He tightened a hinge screw. "The fence said, you don't get to make that choice. She makes that choice, and the choice is no." Thomas thought about this. "So the fence isn't really about cattle." "The fence is about cattle," Elias said, "but it's also about other things." "About who decides?" Thomas said. Elias looked at his son. The green eyes, Caroline's eyes, looking back at him with the careful attention of someone assembling a picture. "Yes," Elias said, "about who decides." Caroline came out to see how the rehanging was going, wiping her hands on her apron, and stood with a leaner on her hip, 3 years old and draped across her mother's side with the fluid comfort of a child who has never questioned that she is securely held. She looked at the gate, and then at Elias, and something passed between them that was entirely private and 8 years deep. A conversation conducted in the language of two people who have built a shared history and no longer need all the words. "How does it hang?" she asked. He swung it open and shut, clean and level. "It's right," he said. She looked at him the way she had been looking at him for 8 years, direct and full and without reservation. "Yes," she said, "it is." They stood on their land in the Oklahoma summer of 1890, the fence running in every direction around them, the orchard heavy with its 8th season of fruit, the children between them and around them, the grave on the ridge behind the house holding its honored place in their shared history and the shared history of this land, the road visible in the distance with the territory moving forward into whatever it would become. Everything that needed to be said had been built or planted or held or spoken. Every fence post driven into the red earth was a word. Every apple tree was a sentence. Every year of the ledger, written in Caroline's careful hand, was a chapter in something that had no end in view, only the good continuation of a life chosen deliberately and held with both hands. The fence stood. The gate swung true, and inside it Elias Townsend had stayed.